What up, gamers? Today we're going to take a look at Judge Dredd, the arcade rail shooter. This was developed and published by Acclaim back in 1997, and it's actually based on the movie, the Judge Dredd movie. And for those who aren't really familiar with Judge Dredd, he's a fictional character that was created by John Wagner. And his depictions, his early depictions anyways, were by Carlos Esguerra. And his character is actually based on the British comic book series, the Judge Dredd series that was published by Rebellion Developments. And so the game actually featured cutscenes from the original movie. We actually took those out because of obvious copyright reasons that we don't want to deal with. Pretty cool game. A lot of people don't even know about this game. This is one of those rail shooters that kind of slipped through the cracks. And this was not mass developed. The arcade cabs for this, they were not in every single arcade imaginable. They were kind of hard to find. It has sort of this blocky 3D sprites. Really cool looking graphics though, I have to say. Especially for 1997, this really was not bad. It was kind of, the characters look like they're kind of on par with something like Virtua Fighter or something like that. So anyways, this is a lot of fun to play. The game has, you can see some of the background objects you can shoot. Like the screens and stuff, you get additional power-ups and points, etc. Kind of a long game. It does get a bit repetitive after a while. If you play the game from start to finish, it does kind of play out the scenes from the movie itself. I thought that was pretty cool. Like I said, we couldn't include those for obvious reasons. You have innocents in this game. You can see those are the yellow, and in this case, the pink guys. And if you shoot them, that takes off your life and your points. And it's a pretty challenging game. It starts out pretty easy and it gets a lot harder as the game carries on. At different points you're battling spaceships. Like this, I thought this was kind of difficult right here. Not the easiest to aim in this game. It's a bit glitchy. This does run in MAME. It does emulate. It's not perfect, but it does work. Just a little bit glitchy. And so the enemies kind of, they just kind of like jump out of the woodwork at you. You can see there's a lot of them. It's really, really hard to catch them all. This is not completely a linear game. There is multiple choice paths. If you know where the indicators are to shoot, there's these flashing indicators at certain doorways, and depending on which one you shoot, that's the route that you'll take within the game. And so now, of course, Acclaim is long gone, right? They're defunct. They're out of business. They went bankrupt. And there was another, actually, this was not the only Judge Dredd arcade game. There was an arcade beat 'em up, and we're going to do a video of that too. I have not covered that one yet. It was really cheesy. That game got completely scrapped. It was never actually published. It was a terrible game. I played it. It was awful. This I thought was pretty solid. I actually like this. I mean, it follows the typical concept that you would expect from an arcade rail shooter. Pretty decent graphics too. So Judge Dredd is kind of like the judge, jury, and executioner of this dystopian future, where you're in this lawless land. And so that's pretty much the story that plays out for Judge Dredd. This is supposed to be way in the future, and you have basically these judges that have the authority to judge and execute criminals. And so basically this game is It's like a couple decades old. It's definitely not by any means brand new. 1997 was a long time ago. There were a lot of rail shooters that came out that year in the arcades. This was one of them that just, for whatever reason, it was not even mass produced. It wasn't really available to most arcades for that reason. Definitely worth checking out, though. I thought it was a pretty decent game. And it's nice to see that it's actually running in MAME. There's still a lot of arcade rail shooters that are not working yet, that are not emulated. And it may be a few more years before we see them actually find them compatible with platforms like MAME. And so these at the end of each stage, this is where the movie cutscenes typically play out. Is right there, right before you start each new level. And man, this game does get hard. This is, I definitely wouldn't say it's easy by any means. If you were to play this in the arcade, you would probably be going through a crap load of quarters. Now we're battling these attack helicopters. You have bombs too. You have a primary gunner. You do have power-up weapons as well. They're kind of placed throughout the stages, throughout the maps. They're not always the easiest to find. Sometimes you have to destroy objects just to reveal them. And you can see in the top left corner of the screen, you've got like this beating heart that is your life indicator, and I thought that was pretty cool. But to be perfectly honest, I'd never got into the Judge Dredd series. That movie was terrible. It had awful reviews. I thought it was a terrible movie. I think it came out in 1995. It was really bad. I thought it was absolutely boring. And I was never a fan of the comic book series. I just could not get into it. It was more like this is sci-fi, you know. This kind of falls in line with the Star Trek type scenario. I always thought Star Trek was kind of fake. I just didn't get into that either. And this series, I just couldn't get into the storyline. But the arcade game, this rail shooter, for what it is, I actually thought it was a really good game. I do like the concept of the game. I just don't like the concept of Judge Dredd so much. And of course you had your typical off-screen reload. That was kind of problematic in MAME. I'm actually playing with a mouse and keyboard, so wow, yeah. Sometimes you'll go to do the off-screen reload, and it just doesn't take the first time. You have to do it again. A lot of like battle droid type enemies in this game, besides these fictional enemies that come out. Some of them do pop out in front of you, like that one guy just did. See, they kind of kick at you. Don't shoot innocents. And that's the thing, throughout each stage of the game, the innocents change colors, so you don't always know exactly what they are right when you start the stage, unless you played the game before. And I really didn't feel bad about leaving the cutscenes out of the video, just for the simple fact that the movie was so incredibly stupid and boring. It's kind of a shame, though, that this game didn't take off in arcades, because I could have seen people playing this. I never actually saw this game in an arcade either, and I grew up in California back in the 80s and 90s, and you know, we had massive arcades with hundreds upon hundreds of arcade games, like Scandia and massive mall arcades and so forth. And this game never once surfaced anywhere. So for whatever reason, they produced this game. It did sell. It did sell to arcades, but I think for whatever reason it was discontinued not long after it went public. And like I said, the second Judge Dredd arcade game, and I think that one was developed by Midway, and we are going to cover it just for historical reasons. It was an awful game. It was a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and it has some really tacky controls. The portrayal of Judge Dredd in that game was just terrible, and you're like battling giant rats. It's so bizarre. And they have this really crappy in-game dialogue in that one as well. I thought this game was more solid. Even though the movie was terrible, the cutscenes were actually kind of add a little bit to the depth of this game. They really did. That helped a little bit. And sometimes it's really quick to react. You can see I actually just hit one of the innocents right there. And that's another thing too. Some of the scenes in this game, some of the end cinematic sequences, they're kind of slow, and it kind of feels like you're just stuck waiting. It's like once you get to the next portal, everything's fine and it breezes right through, but the end of the stages can be kind of slow. And the graphics in this game, like the portrayal of the background scenery and the way the graphics appear, this game feels a lot like Area 51. I mean, look at the crates and stuff. I mean, this is really very, very reminiscent of the classic Area 51 from Atari. Which was actually one of their more successful games. Now, I don't know if this game was ever ported to consoles. Not that I know of. I doubt it. Like I said, it didn't take off in the arcades. I don't see why they would have ported over to consoles. Usually, the arcade games that really take off, they almost always get ported because, let's face it, the developers and publishers want to make money. And if it's something that resonates with the public audience at the arcades, it's probably going to resonate at home. Because, look at a lot of Sega's games, like, all the Virtua series games, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, stuff like that. A lot of their fighting games were all ported to consoles. SNK's done much the same thing. There's how many SNK games are on... back in the PlayStation, the PS1 and PS2 days, you had Metal Slug, you had all the SNK fighting games. Not all of them, but you had a lot of them. The Metal Slug Anthology was on there. It was on the original Xbox, I believe, PS2. But Acclaim made a lot of really good games. They were a really good developer and publisher, and they were actually very successful. I mean, they were bringing in, at one point in the 90s, I think they were rolling in like, hundreds of millions of dollars a year in revenue from the development of games. And they were a huge, huge publisher for the original Nintendo. I can't count how many Acclaim games there were on the original Nintendo, and they just made mass money. Their games were really successful. People really, really liked them, but they made a lot of bad bets. It's kind of like what happened to Crytek more recently. It's the same thing happened to Acclaim. They had put a bunch of money to a bunch of projects, and the projects fell through. And some of these game development projects can cost tens of millions of dollars. And so if they don't invest their money in the right place, they're screwed. They're gonna lose. This guy's really tough. This giant hovercraft battle droid thing. It seems like it takes forever to take this guy out. You've got to shoot these cannons that he's got. But anyways, yeah, Acclaim pretty much met the same fate. Very, very similar. They ended up bankrupt. They were going broke towards, the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. Things just didn't work out. They fell apart. And that's kind of what happened to Crytek. Crytek had invested in a bunch of game development projects, and they lost tens of millions of dollars. And at one point, they couldn't even pay their employees. So that really says something about what the risks involved in developing video games. One moment you could be at the top of your game and be a developer or publisher that's raking in hundreds of millions of dollars. Next thing you know, you're bleeding and hemorrhaging funds and you're hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. And all it takes is a few failed game projects, and that's what happened to Atari back in the early 1990s. Every single game that they published just did not take off. They just didn't make enough revenue. In many cases, some of the games that did okay in the arcades and on consoles didn't produce a profit despite their popularity. The development costs ended up outweighing the revenue. I thought this stage was pretty cool. You shoot these elevators that are going up and down. These glass, they got these huge glass screens. And you can see, like I said, the screen gets really, really busy. There's so many enemies, you can't possibly shoot them all. This game was definitely designed to take your money. I do recommend playing this. I know there's a lot of main gamers on YouTube. If you haven't played this, the game, like I said, it does emulate. It is not perfect. Graphics-wise, it's actually pretty spot on for most of the game. It's just, you get a few areas that there's kind of like a few slowdowns and some glitches, like the corridor on the second stage will be, earlier in the game that we went through already. That part, you'll be firing your gun and it's not hitting the enemies. It's really strange, and I think that's just a glitch from the emulation itself. 3, 2. And like I said, this does get repetitive after a while. It does start to feel a bit repetitive. The only good part about it is that despite its repetitiveness, it gets really challenging as the game goes on. You can look at this. You've got these fixed gunners that are going off on me. More innocents to have to dodge. And like I said, you do have bombs. They're kind of limited. You can pick up new ones. The power-up weapons don't last long. It's kind of just basically like an auto gun, like an assault rifle, and it unleashes for like 20 seconds or so, and then it's kind of done again, and you're back to this regular gunner. Like here, I just picked up some power-ups, some missiles. They can really do a lot of damage. They can take out a large group of enemies all at once. The trick is to use them at the right time. And I don't know, the characters kind of have like this, I don't know, they kind of look like, do feel a bit reminiscent of like the Virtua Fighter characters, but at the same time, they almost look like crash test dummies. Like these 3D versions of the crash test dummies is kind of strange. These giant teeth. And that's one of the, I really didn't like the off-screen reload in this game, because you have so many enemies on the screen. They should have given it like a button reload where you're not having to aim off screen, being that it's so time consuming. Like, I didn't mind the off-screen reload in games like T2 Arcade. I thought that was pretty decent, but this is just ridiculous when you have all this stuff shooting at you and you only get like 5 shots, and then you have to reload again. You don't get enough shots. It's really the problem. Now we're on to stage 4. It's kind of a long game. You know, some rail shooters are, like I think we did, was it Operation Thunderbolt recently, was another rail shooter that we covered. I think that game was like 15 minutes. Some are really short. Then you have other games like T2 Arcade that are a bit longer, and this was kind of long. Look at that! They look like crash test dummies. So yeah, besides its repetitiveness, the graphics are actually really, I thought, really cool. This is definitely a game worth adding to your main cabinet and collection. It's just hard to imagine that Acclaim failed after all these years. You know, here they did so well, and it's just like a few bad investment decisions, a few failed game projects. That's all it took, and you can just end up in so much debt you just can't get out. And it was really disheartening to see Crytek fall apart when they did, because I've always been a huge fan of the Far Cry series. I've been playing it since the original game. I did the PC version. I played it mostly on the original Xbox and the 360 back during the days of Far Cry Predator. And that game had a built-in map editor. It had a built-in map editor, and you could basically build the maps that you played on. And it was kind of like a drag and drop template that you could build, you know, islands, you could build a city, you had vehicles, you could build towers. It was really cool. People did a lot of creative stuff in that game. Same with Far Cry 2. Although from a playability standpoint, Far Cry 2 was a terrible game, but the graphics were amazing. You could really build compelling maps with it. Wow, look at this thing. Oh! Actually, hit one of the innocents. So yeah, we are going to cover the other, the second Judge Dredd arcade, just for historical reasons. Like I said, it was a terrible game. I don't even recommend playing it. It's just not good. And like I said, that one was not developed by... The second one was not developed by Acclaim. The other one was developed by Midway. I thought this was a lot more solid game. Plus, we've been trying to cover a lot of rail shooters. I don't know how many rail shooter like-gun games we covered. Maybe like 25 or something so far. I don't know. We've tried to cover every game that can possibly be emulated. Sometimes it's trickier than that. Sometimes you have to, you know, for the games that aren't emulated, you may have to go out and find somebody who has the arcade hardware and figure out, you know, who you can get a hold of, who you can, you know, how can you access the original arcade games. Then it's a matter of hooking it up in a manner to where you can capture the game footage. That can get tricky as well, depending on the boards that you're dealing with. It can be really challenging. But the majority of videos, you know, our biggest playlist is classic arcade games. So this is really what we try to focus on the most, is the arcade games. We've done a few rail shooters that didn't work, and where we couldn't get the arcade versions. We were able to find console ports like on PS2 or so forth, and then cover those. I figured it was better than nothing, rather than skipping over an entire game. I don't know if we'll ever be able to cover every single rail shooter in existence, but hopefully be able to get a majority of them over time. You can see their faces kind of have, some of them have like these, you know, they kind of got like this look of like the T2 droid, you know? Like half metal, half human type thing. And the background imagery, it has this real like it looks like digitized sprites, like it's all digitized images, 3D scaled, of course, because you know the background images in games like Lethal Enforcers, those were all digitized imagery, but they didn't have any 3D scaling effects at all. You didn't have anything like this. This is really interesting how they did this. But other than this game, or outside of this game, I actually have zero interest. I totally have zero interest in Judge Dredd. And like I said, it really didn't help them. A lot of people did like the comic book series, but it really didn't help the franchise when they released one of the crappiest movies imaginable. The game completely flopped at the box office. Was not surprised. It was really bad. And so anyways, that is Judge Dredd, the arcade rail shooter. So I'm going to end the commentary here. I'm going to let the rest of the game play out. Many thanks for watching. You can watch the rest of the game. This is pretty much a full playthrough. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest videos. Do check out our arcade games playlist if you're an arcade fan. We cover a lot of classic arcade games, fighting games, rail shooters, racing games, etc. There's a huge selection. I think this actually marks, the 150th game we've covered, or the 150th video anyways. Some games we covered in more than one video. But we are at the 150 video mark. And this is actually, we're getting towards the end of the game here. I think this is one of the final bosses, so yeah, there's not much left to this game. So anyways, be sure to like and subscribe, and many thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.